loathsome Laidley Worm. And she ordered it to go out and swim once and twice and 3 times about the boat and cause a great whirlpool and sink that boat. And it did its mistress's bidding. And the Laidley Worm swam out, and it swam around the boat that was made of the rowan tree so strong against the witchetty kind, and it caused a great whirlpool. Oh, and truly it tried to sink the boat, but the boat was made of the rowan tree, and it could not sink it. And now the great and terrible loathsome Laidley Worm wrapped itself about a stone by the side of the North Sea, and a place that is there to this day called Adder Stone. For the Laidley Worm was a great and terrible snaky monster, and it wrapped itself about the great Adder Stone. The child Wine's boat had been tossed from place to place upon the sea, but still he landed in Bamburgh Bay. He was tired, he was wet, he was cold, but he knew just where he had to go. He went from Bamburgh Bay all of the way to the Adder Stone, and here he saw that great and terrible loathsome Laidley Worm wrapped about the Adder Stone, and he raised his sword high in the air, and he was just about to chop off its head when it raised its head and spoke. "Put down your sword and kisses give me 3, and I once more fair Margaret shall be." He listened. It sounded like his sister, but how could this terrible worm be his sister? And yet again he raised his sword high in the air, and again the loathsome, terrible Laidley Worm spoke. "Put down your sword and kisses give me 3, and I once more fair Margaret shall be." But how could this terrible worm be his sister? This time he raised the sword high above his head, and without raising its own head, the Laidley Worm closed its eyes and lowered its head and spoke. "Put down your sword and kisses give me 3, and I once more fair Margaret shall be." There was something about the voice that made the child Wind think that there was just a grain of possibility of it being his sister. He sheathed his sword. He reached towards its head, held it in his hands and kissed it once between its eyes, and once upon one cheek, and once upon the other, and there was a rushing sound and a rippling sound, and this great and terrible loathsome Laidley Worm reared up, and it split, and from out of the belly and guts of this great and terrible monstrous worm there stepped his sister, the fair and lovely Margaret. He took off his cloak, wrapped it about her shoulders. He said, "My sister, our father will be pleased that I have returned, happy to know that the Laidley Worm is dead. But he will rejoice when he knows that I have brought you, my sister, the fair and lovely Margaret, back to Bamburgh Castle." The two of them walked side by side, he with his arm about her shoulder, she pulling his cloak close to her skin, and they walked all of the way back from Bamburgh Bay to Bamburgh Castle. And so the two of them returned to the great and wonderful Bamburgh Castle. In their echoing halls, the two of them stood in front of the king and the queen. The king was excited to see his son return, but ecstatic to find out that the fair and lovely Margaret was returned to him. The child Wine stood there, a full-grown man, a sword in his hand, a shield in front of him, proud in all of his armour, and said, "Father, I have returned, and I have rid this country of the great and loathsome Laidley worm. And I have found my own sister inside of the belly and guts of that great creature. And I have returned. And now I will tell you that this woman, and here he pointed towards the witchetty queen, this woman has used her weirding ways upon you, and she did place falsehoods upon your heart so that you would marry her, and she changed your own daughter into a Laidley worm, and now it is her turn. And here he reached for, not his sword, but a twig of the rowan tree. The rowan tree so strong against the witchetty kind, and he pointed it towards that woman. And he ran it from the top of her head to the tips of her toes, and ran it from one shoulder to the other. And there the woman changed before their very eyes. Her arms became shorter, her skin became green and slimy, and smaller she came, till she was no bigger than the child wine's fist. And she turned before their very eyes into a green and slimy, loathsome Laidley toad. He picked her up, showed it to the king. This, Father, is all that is left of that woman who has played her falsehood upon your heart. And now, and he took that great loathsome Laidley toad and flung it to the base of the deepest well inside of Bamburgh Castle. And from that time there was happiness within Bamburgh Castle. But the king, it was often said that at the tick and tock of midnight, by the side of that place, by the deepest and darkest of wells, there could be heard the sound of a green and terrible, loathsome Laidley toad.
Thank you.